Okay, that's running. You're going to get the slide up. It's weird. Or do you want to try that button? This is the thing. This is okay.
I'm just going to go out and back in.
Okay.
Can I close this?
Yep.
I actually don't have to.
So is the webcast going? Announcement for the webcast? Those of us joining on the webcast will be starting in just about a minute or two.
All right, hello everyone and welcome. Welcome to the first lecture and webinar of the Chris Walsh Center for Educators and Families of Metro West since our grand opening a few weeks back. This is the type of events that we'll be holding using this hybrid format of in-person and online, as well as the session being recorded for later viewing. So we expect to have close to 100 people joining us here in person, and over, I think, full 400 people have registered for the online webinar, and it looks like we've got about 100 online so far. The center's mission is to provide information for families and educators about the continuum of educational supports available to students with disabilities, students who are gifted, and students with other unmet needs. Our center will offer support and workshops and programming for families and educators and student support professionals, administrators, advocates, others in the Metro West area, and beyond. And the Chris Walsh Center is a floating center, so we will be holding events like this in person on our campus, as well as online and off campus in the community. So please visit the Chris Walsh Center's website to learn more about our programs, to contact us, find our social media. And registration is also open now for our next lecture and webinar titled Supporting Twice Exceptional Learners at School and at Home with Dr. Mary Grace Stewart. That's on Wednesday, April 29th at 10:30 a.m. local time. Again, you could attend here in the McCarthy Center Forum or join the webinar. And I forgot to mention, I'm Dr. James Cressy, the coordinator of the Chris Walsh Center. So it's very nice to have all of you here and online. All right, today we're excited to have Dr. Nadine Gaab here to share her expertise on the science of typical and atypical literacy development. Dr. Gaab's work focuses on developmental cognitive neuroscience, particularly in language-based learning disabilities. Dr. Gaab is an associate professor of pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, as well as a member of the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Gaab has received many awards and honors for her research and advocacy. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Nadine Gaab. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you very much for having me today, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this first lecture. It's a big honor. Yeah, today we'll talk about early identification and really explore the question of screening for dyslexia and how should we do this, why should we do this, where should we do this, and what are some of the challenges we are facing right now. So this is an overview about the next 45, 50 minutes. We'll talk about typical and atypical reading development and its neurobiology. So we'll talk about the brain and which areas are important for learning to read and what is different in children and adults who are struggling with learning to read. We'll also talk about brain changes following remediation or intervention. So looking at, what areas in the brain are changing and how are they changing after a successful intervention. We will then introduce the dyslexia paradox, which is the discrepancy between when we currently diagnose dyslexia or other reading disabilities and when we know is the optimal window for intervention. I will then talk about early markers of reading difficulties before reading onset. So a lot of the work we do is focusing on the very little ones. So we do a lot of work in infants and preschoolers and early kindergartners and really see, are there any behavioral markers? Are there any markers in the brain that can tell us who is at risk for developing reading problems before they even start any formal reading instruction? We'll then talk about early screening, the why, the when, the how, the where, and the whom. And then at the end, we can discuss educational and clinical implications. Okay. Learning trajectories are shaped by the dynamic interplay between nature and nurture, which starts in utero and continues throughout the lifespan. If you look at this, we have a genotype, so our building blocks more or less, but the phenotypes are a variety of these genotypes depending on their interaction with the environment and developmental trajectories. Learning differences are often not identified until childhood or even adolescence, but diverging trajectories of brain development, we'll talk about this, may be present as early as prenatally. So here, I'll walk you through this. You see on the bottom here, age. So it starts at 20-week gestation, so in utero, and goes all the way to 20 years here. And then we have the change in percent in the different colors represent different cell types basically in the brain. So as you can see, we have like, for instance, here in red, cortical gray matter, which are the neurons on the cortical surface that actually do a lot of the processing. As another example, we have here in this lighter rosé or pink color, white matter, which are basically the axons that are bridging the different brain areas so that communication can happen between brain area A to brain area B, for example. What you can see here, that's the take-home message, is that the majority of change, or the biggest change in percent, is actually in the first 2 years. Okay, so that doesn't mean that the brain is not changing anymore afterwards, and we'll explore this, but it just should illustrate that this is a really important window. So if you think about language development, if you think about reading development, if we think about any development, we should really pay attention to these first 2 years. Learning to read is a process that requires the mastering of a series of developmental stages in response to environmental input. And this starts with language processing in utero and ends with proficient reading years later. So if you look at this, this is my timeline of typical reading development. And usually when you ask people, like, when does reading development start? You get a variety of answers. Some people may say, well, the first day of kindergarten, really, when you get formal instruction. Someone would say, well, maybe the first time they watch Sesame Street and learn about letters. Some people may say maybe in preschool when you practice your rhymes and your letters, etc. Actually, reading development starts in utero. And it starts in utero because the fundamental milestone for learning to read is sound processing and language processing. And sound and language processing are starting in utero. So if you talk about reading development, I'm often puzzled that people start at the first day of kindergarten or maybe even, preschool. It actually starts way earlier because language is such a fundamental, important piece to learning to read. And so we should really expand the timeline, not just in this direction, but also in this direction. So if you look, let's go a little bit in the different stages. We have sound and language processing early on, and really the first couple of years is really the milestone is to successfully acquire language. Syntax, as well as vocabulary, as well as our listening comprehension are really important precursors of later learning to read. And these are established in the first couple of years. Then in preschool, early kindergarten, you have a milestone called phonological or phonemic awareness, which is the ability to manipulate the sounds of language. So you could say the word banana, but don't say b, or say the word fixed, but don't say k. Or I give you 3 sounds and ask them to blend together, like b, t, or something like this, okay? So, and this has also developmental stages. So there's easier stages or lower stages, such as rhyming is much easier than deletion or deleting sounds from a word. And then one other important piece is letter recognition, to actually recognize that this is a letter, that the letter has the right direction. And then, slowly there's single word reading and connected text reading. And the ultimate goal of learning to read is reading fluency, reading with great automaticity, reading fluently, and comprehending what you read. So what we do know is that learning to read, there's a shift from learning to read to reading to learn, and that really happens in this country usually around the end of 2nd, beginning of 3rd grade, but it can vary depending on the school type. So what that means is that usually educators stop actively teaching how to read, and then just assume that you're reading, and then they use reading as one tool in their teaching process that will help with, math problems and social science, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're not reading by the time that shift happens, then suddenly your struggling reading will lead to problems not only with reading, but or English arts. It also then leads to problems with math and word problems. It can also lead to problems with, for instance, social communication. So if people on the friends on the playground talk about, oh, I read Harry Potter last night, I'm at chapter 4, and you can't even figure out the first sentence of Harry Potter, that has tremendous implication for your social life as well. And we'll get more about this later. So you've probably seen this all before. So this is very famous. It's the reading rope by Hollis Scarborough. And what it illustrates is that there are 2 important big elements of successful reading acquisition. One is the word recognition piece that most people would name first when you say what are some of the essential components for learning to read. That is phonological awareness, as we discussed before, decoding, sight word recognition, and as indicated here, it becomes increasingly automatic in a typical reader. And then you go on and improve this and become a skilled reader. But we cannot forget that there's another huge component for successful reading acquisition, which is the language piece, right? And I give you a couple of examples. So you could be a really good decoder. So you could be easily deciphering, single words, but you may have really low vocabulary. And so every, let's say, 3rd or 4th word you're deciphering, you just don't know the meaning of. Okay, so that will then lead to problems in reading fluently because you have to figure out how the word is pronounced, you don't know the word, but also it has tremendous implication for reading comprehension, right? Because you will not understand what the sentence is saying. The same is with syntax, right? So if you are coming from a family or an environment where you're only hearing very short sentences, let's say no commas, nothing complex, then when you start reading and you start encountering more complex sentences, it will be really hard for you to read them fluently or comprehend them if you don't have that prior knowledge. And so you may know every single word in that sentence. You may know the meaning of every single word, but you don't know how the end of the sentence relates to the beginning of the sentence, which then can lead to problems with reading as well. Another issue can be and so these are just two different examples. So it's really important when we think about screening, if we think about early identification, that we not just keep this part in mind, but also keep the upper part in mind. Okay, so let's look at childhood reading skills and outcomes. So the development of basic reading skills is one of the primary goals of elementary education. But recent research, and I'll show you the NAB scores that came out at the end of last year, show that 65% of fourth graders are reading below grade level, and that has unchanged in the last 25 years. And approximately 80% of those from low socioeconomic backgrounds are also reading below grade level. So one thing that a lot of people forget when we talk about struggling readers is the implication for mental health. Okay, so we know that if you're a struggling reader, that you have higher rates of anxiety and you have higher rates of depression. We also know that it affects self-esteem really early on. And we also know that it affects your motivation to read and your motivation to learn in general. Right? So you probably were, let's say, the fastest little 5-year-old on the playground. You were really high and you felt really good about yourself. You start kindergarten or preschool, and then suddenly all your peers can figure out how the sounds of the language that you learned as well, relate to these scribbles on the page, but you can't. You just can't figure it out. So that leads to tremendous changes in your self-esteem. It can also really affect the motivation to learn in general. So there's even people who think that reading is a child's first job. Right? So the first day of kindergarten, everyone's like, oh, you're going to start reading and it's going to be so fun, and oh, you're going to read to your little sister soon, et cetera, et cetera. This is your first job. If you fail in your first job, it has tremendous implication on your mental health. And I think we have to really keep that in mind. And so the later we identify these struggling readers, the more of these, negative feelings are, internalized and can, really affect mental health. If we look at adolescents' adult outcomes, children with learning disabilities are less likely to complete high school if they don't get any intervention or remediation, or pursue higher education, and are at an increased risk to enter the juvenile justice system. So there's even some studies that suggest that a third to a fourth of all inmates in the United States have some form of language-based learning disability. Up to 92% of working age adults have really minimal incomes. So 67% of this one study earned 25K or less. So it has a tremendous implication for your economic future as well. Okay, so let's look at these NAB scores. So these are from the National Center for Education Statistics. And what you can see here is the assessment year. So it's assessed every 2 years. And you can see the scale score here. And in order to be proficient, so you would have to have a score around 240. So on average, you see here the scores for each year. And this is where the 65% of fourth graders reading below grade level number comes from, right? And so what you can see is that it is below proficient on average. But also, what I said before, it hasn't changed in 25 years. All right? So all the policies we implemented so far, No Child Left Behind, whatever we did, it did not move the needle. So I think we need to move outside of the box. And so I'll give you some of the ideas, and screening is part of this, where basically, as a summary, we need to move from a deficit-oriented or a reactive model in education, where we just simply wait till someone shows up with a problem, to a proactive or preventative model in education, where we try to identify the kids who will most likely struggle and help them before they even start struggling. And we'll talk a lot about this. So let's talk about how reading improves learning. So here you see kindergarten and 5th grade, and on this axis here you see the size of vocabulary. So on average, that number changes depending on research studies, but it centers maybe around the 10K here. So on average, a kindergartner starts kindergarten with a vocabulary of about 10,000 words. So that means that they know the meaning of 10,000 words. So the knowledge comes from your parents, it comes from your caregivers. The really bad words come from your siblings, right? I have 3 kids myself, so the vocabulary of my 5-year-old is very different than the vocabulary of my almost 10-year-old. So by 5th grade, you have increased your vocabulary to 60,000, let's say, on average. So that's about 250 per week. Okay, so we know from research that most of this increase comes from reading. And it doesn't mean that you need to sit down and read like a huge novel. It really also comes from you just reading at the doctor's office or on the bus stop, or just the instruction for your video game, etc., etc. So that adds new words to your vocabulary. So what happens if you are a struggling reader? So we know that students at the 90th percentile, so only 10% of those read better, may read as many words outside of school in 3 days as students at the 10th percentile read an entire year outside of school. All right? So you quickly see how this has tremendous implication for not just reading or not just figuring out the math problem, but also background knowledge, what you know about the world, your knowledge about how sentences are constructed, etc., etc. We also know that 70% of below average readers in 1st grade remain below average readers in 8th grade. Okay, so we do know that we can find them as early as kindergarten or even earlier, and I'll show you. So there's no reason to wait long and really have them suffer and jeopardize their future. So what are the factors contributing to atypical reading development? We have genetics, we'll talk about this. We have the brain, we have perception and cognition, and we have the environment. Okay, so we now know that struggling readers or children, adults with dyslexia, it's a multifactorial problem. So there's not one cause, and it's a combination of these factors and how they interact with each other that leads to atypical reading development. So we see the reading disability as an umbrella, and dyslexia is under that umbrella. But not all children who struggle with reading, the 65% I showed you before, have dyslexia. Okay, so we need to do this out through. So you can also have problems with reading as a result of environmental circumstances. So that's really the upper part of that rope that I showed you, like where someone comes in with like low vocabulary, or the oral listening comprehension is poor, syntax comprehension is poor. You can also have low language skills because you have an underlying language problem. Okay, so it has nothing to do with the environment, but you could have like a specific language impairment, or now it's called developmental language disorder, DLD, right? So we have to distinguish these two. But what's important really is they benefit from the same interventions. Okay, so it's important, but if you have those in the classroom, they benefit from the exactly same interventions, and there's been some great research coming out of the Florida Center for Reading Research supporting this. All right, so let's look at genetics. So what we do know is that if you have an older sibling with dyslexia or a parent with dyslexia, you have about a 50% of developing dyslexia yourself. So this is pretty high, right? This is much higher than a lot of the other developmental disabilities. So that also means that if you ask this as an educator the first day, any kindergarten or any class, right? If you just ask, is there anyone in your family that struggled with learning to read? And if someone says yes, you just dig a little deeper and you say, where did they grow up? Did they have, educational opportunities? And you can figure out where that problem with reading comes from, and then you determine whether there's a genetic risk. Okay, but if you just go by that as a screening, you will have a lot of misses and a lot of false alarm, because only half of these kids will develop problems with reading. Okay, we also know that the environmental factors explain about 30% of individual differences in reading. Okay, with parental socioeconomic status having the most influence. All right, so let's look at the brain. Children are wired for sound, but print is an optional accessory that must be painstakingly bolted on. This is one of my favorite quotes by Steven Pinker, across the river. What's important here is that learning to read is not a natural process. It's not that the children wake up one morning and they miraculously can learn, they can read. Also, it's not that you can just surround a child with books, like you lock them in the library, and they will eventually figure out how to read. No, it needs to be explicitly taught. Okay, it's similar to playing Mozart on the piano. Right? If you listen to Mozart all your life, and then I put you in front of a piano, that doesn't mean you can play Mozart. Right? It needs to be explicitly taught. That's really important. And that's where it differs from language, right? So where language, at least some components, you can learn by just being surrounded by language. And so that's a very important distinction between the two. Okay, so let's look at the brain. We'll look at the brain from the left-hand side. So this is the front, this is the back, this is the top, and this is the bottom. Okay, and so here you see the same front, back, top, and bottom. So we're looking onto the brain from this side, and you see the brain areas here. And so these are called the lobes, and they have different functions. So for instance, the occipital lobe does primarily visual processing. So anything that comes through your eyes is processed here. It's a little interesting that we have here the eyes and it's processed back here, but I did not design this, so I'm not sure why it's that way. This is the temporal lobe. It's very important because it does this early sound processing, this early language processing, and continues to do so. And so then we have the lobe, which does a lot of mapping and multimodal integration. So in the early process of learning to read, you need to map the sounds of language that you learned over so many years onto the written counterparts, the letters, and that happens a lot in that triangle between these three lobes here. We'll get to this. And then we have the frontal lobe, which is the CEO of the brain. So it does what the CEO does in a company. It decides what's important, what's not important, what can I ignore. It integrates things into a bigger picture, et cetera, et cetera. So during puberty, we have major construction in the frontal lobe. So that explains a lot of these behaviors that we observe, because you basically have a company without a CEO for a couple of years. So, okay, so let's look at the reading network. And I'll explain you the reading network first, and then I'll give you a video showing someone reading, and you will be an expert explaining what's going on. Okay, so this area here in red, it's called the fusiform gyrus. You don't have to remember this, but remember it's the letterbox of the brain. And what's important is it's experience dependent, so it only develops if you are explicitly taught, and it exclusively recognizes letters and words. So it's a really cool area, right? So if you grow up in this country, it responds to our Roman Latin language, alphabet. So if you show letters and you were taught and can read, it would you would see that there is oxygen changes or activation in this area, but it may not activate for Hebrew letters if you don't know how to read in Hebrew. If you grow up in Israel, it may wait for Hebrew letters, but not for our alphabet. And if you're bilingual, it may activate for both. It's a really cool area because it's experience dependent. So meaning if you're illiterate, so there's been some studies in 50 and 60-year-olds who are illiterate, and they could show that after teaching these adults to learn to read, that this area then became active, so developed. So if you're an educator and you go to a cocktail party next week and someone asks you what you do for a living, you should say, I change brain on a daily basis, right? Because that's what you do, and parents too. Okay, so this is really important because we need to recognize letters and we need to recognize words, right? So then we have the superior temporal lobe here, and that does language processing and sound processing, okay? So that's really important because we need to map the sounds onto the letters, right? And that's primarily done here in that area here. And so we have a triangle early on that enables us to map the sounds of language onto the written counterparts. And that's why it's so important to teach the sounds, what sounds these letters make, because you want to develop a healthy reading network, a typical reading network. So it's really important to empathize and practice these, phonics early on to make sure that the foundation for the reading network is actually there. And then later on, we have that CEO here. And so that helps us with reading comprehension, reading fluency, and really integrating what we read into the bigger picture. But it comes online a little bit later, okay? So we have that initially, and then we have like the whole reading network here. So don't go home or go back from your computer in the kitchen and say, there's just 4 areas in the left side of the brain and they all do all the reading. That's not true. So it's a lot more complex. This is really just to illustrate, some of the most important components. But we do use more brain areas. We use both sides. There's now left brain learners or right brain learners, right? But these are very important components that we will discuss a lot today. Okay, so then we have these highways. And so these are axons that enable the different brain areas to talk to each other so that information can flow from, let's say, the visual word form area to the sound area, or the visual word form area here, the letterbox, to the CEO. Okay, and so these are these highways, and you don't have to remember their names. But one important one is this red one here, and it's called the arcuate fasciculus. You can just remember it as being the arc because it's shaped like an arc. And it is really important because it connects basically the back of the reading network here, that triangle, with the CEO of the reading network. Okay, we'll learn a lot more about this. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a video, and you are all going to be experts now because you know about the different brain areas and what they do. So this is an adult. Again, you see it from the left side. This is the front, this is the back, the top and the bottom. And you will see the adult reading a couple of words, and you will see colors that represent oxygen changes or where the neurons are working while this adult is reading a couple of words. Okay, so I'll play it twice, and we can look at it together. Okay, so ready? All right, the first reaction I usually get is, whoa, there's so many different brain areas involved in just reading a couple of words. All right, what's really important is, and I want you to watch it again, to look at the timing. So what happens first, and what brain areas are engaged first, and what happens after this, et cetera, right? Okay, so you can nicely see that we have the letterbox of the brain be engaged first, makes a lot of sense. You then go through all of these language areas, right? And then you go to the CEO of the reading network. Okay, so it's really important that we build this reading network, and teaching is what makes children develop this. All right, so what happens if you're a struggling reader? So there's a lot of work out there that show that this reading network I just introduced to you is different if you're a struggling reader or if you have a diagnosis of dyslexia. So you can look at the gray matter, so actually count the number of neurons, sort of. And you can see that children and adults with dyslexia have less neurons in these areas of the reading network. We also know that the highways connecting the different areas seem to be atypical as well. Okay, so different. And so instead of 4 lanes on a highway, sometimes we see only 2 lanes. Or we could say, instead of a smooth surface, a really bumpy surface. Which makes information flow slower. Or we could see a lot of crossing fibers. So you saw this beautiful arc, but in some children it looks a lot more chaotic. So it's almost like a highway where you have a lot of traffic lights and crossing fibers, which will slow down information. Okay. So what I do a lot of professional development in schools, and what I often hear is, oh, you know what? Some of these kids are just slow, they're just maturing slow. It's a summer baby. He's a boy. Let's just wait a couple of years, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And so this study here by 2 colleagues of mine, John Gabrieli at MIT and Fumiko Heft, she's at UCSF, what they did is they did a very interesting study where they took 9-year-olds who have dyslexia and first compared them to 9-year-olds without dyslexia. And they could show that the back of the brain, where that triangle is, was different, as many different studies have shown before. Then they took the 9-year-olds with dyslexia and compared them to 6-year-olds who were reading on the same level. All right. So if your brain is delayed and has delayed maturation, and you're reading on the same level, the 9-year-olds with dyslexia should look like the 6-year-olds without dyslexia, right? Because they're reading on the same brain, the same reading level. And what they could show is, nope, the same fundamental difference could be observed between these two. So that was another part that explains to us that, dyslexia is atypical brain development. So the brain development is different. And we now know that it can be as early as in utero, and I'll show you some of these studies as well. Also, in terms of IQ, research has shown that it doesn't matter if you have high IQ and you're a struggling reader or lower IQ and you're a struggling reader. The brain differences are exactly the same. All right? Okay, so what happens if you intervene? And what happens to these brain networks that I just introduced to you? So here, again, it's the left side, right? You're used to this now. So the front, the back, the top, and the bottom. This is just blown up so you can see the different valleys and mountains better. And so what you can see here in control children, they were asked to decide whether 2 letters rhyme. You can see like there's parts of the reading network here, and these are I don't know, early and elementary schools. And you could show that in children who were struggling, you have less activation, especially in the back of that reading network. So they did then 8 weeks of intervention, which led to improvement of reading. And you could see this is prior to intervention, and this is after intervention. So you can see that even though there's atypical brain development, you can do something about it. Okay, so if you're a reading specialist or a special educator here, so this is really, what you can do if a child gets the right intervention, and especially if that happens at the right time. Okay, so this also has been done in adults with similar results, and these changes are long-lasting, at least in kids whose reading stays, on the typical level. So here they show that even 2 years after the end of intervention, if the children were still reading on grade level, you could see the same changes persisted. All right, so let's talk about the dyslexia paradox. So when it comes to learning differences, we are largely focused on a reactive, deficit-driven way-to-fail model instead of the development of preventive approaches. Okay, so we really wait. We wait for a really long time. A lot of the times, at least what I see, you wait till the end of second, maybe third grade. Okay, so that's kindergarten, first grade, second grade, sometimes pre-kindergarten, right? 4 years. Just imagine what this does to vocabulary development, to the development of background knowledge, to mental health of these children. So the idea is to really move to a proactive preventative model. All right, and so we have this in medicine, and let me walk you through this first, and then I'll explain this to you. So the way to fail approach really is that usually the diagnosis, and really say like, okay, here's a diagnosis of dyslexia, then the start of very intensive intervention in response to this starts maybe the earliest, the end of second, beginning of third grade. But we know that the window for the most effective intervention is in K and first, maybe even pre-K. So there's lots of studies showing that effect sizes are much higher in kindergarten and first grade compared to second and third grade. There's studies, meta-analysis showing that if you at-risk beginning readers receive intensive instruction, 50 to 90% reach the range of average reading ability. All right, so we do this in medicine, and that's so puzzling to me, right? So if you think about medicine, we embrace preventative models. Let's say, let's take the example of heart disease, okay? So people are screened for high cholesterol. If they have high cholesterol, they don't get a diagnosis right away for heart disease. They get like interventions right then. Usually you change your diet, maybe you get medication, you start exercising. The ultimate goal is that you never develop heart disease. Or if you develop heart disease, it's less severe because you already did all of these changes. All right? So I don't know why we can't do this in education. Right? In education, we're still really stuck at someone had a heart attack. What are we going to do? All right? So we really have to shift our thinking to a preventative model and really think, how can we best identify children who will most likely struggle with learning to read, and what can we do right now so that they will never struggle? Okay, so what are the early behavioral predictors of reading difficulties? And so there's been so many studies, I couldn't even fit them all on here, all right? So it's not that it's like one big study that came out last year and it's highly controversial because half of the people think the method is off, whatever. No, it has been shown so many times and over the last 25 plus years. So the science of reading is there when it comes to early predictors. And all of these studies find that phonological awareness, pseudo-word repetition, so repeating a word that someone says to you, like badikuba, rapidomatized naming, which is naming objects or colors from left to right, different rows in reading direction as fast as possible, which is a really good predictor of reading fluency. Letter sound knowledge, letter knowledge, vocabulary, and oral listening comprehension are the best predictors of later reading outcome. And we can measure these, and most of these studies have done this in K or even younger than kindergarten. Okay, so let's look at some of our work. So the Boston Longitudinal Dyslexia Study started in 2008. And I have people in the room that have now kids graduating from college or graduating from high school or even from college who were part of this almost. So what we did is we really wanted to move this diagnosis of dyslexia reading difficulty and really tackle with this and see how can we identify children at risk, right? And how can we identify them in preschool or even earlier than this? And so we looked at brain structure and brain function and language and pre-reading assessments and home literacy, like how many books do they have at home, how often someone reads to them, and all of these variables. And then we followed them over many, many years. And so some of them were even followed 7, 8 years continuously. And there's about 135, 140 now in the preschool study, and about 130 now in the baby study. So we either what we do is we take preschoolers that either have a strong familiar risk or not. So we know if they have a familiar risk, that about half of them will develop problems with reading, and then we follow them over many years and look at their developmental trajectory of learning to read, language, but also brain development and all these other factors. And then we have a study in babies. I'll show you some results as well, where we follow babies all the way to 2nd grade and see how early can we see these brain characteristics. Is it that they develop because of their daily struggle with language or daily struggle with learning to read, or do they predate the onset of formal reading instruction? And what we could show in all of these studies, and we've been doing this for many, many years, 15 plus years, is that the results from our work, as well as many different other studies from Finland and the UK, etc., suggest that the atypical brain development predates the onset of formal instruction. Okay, so children are stepping into the first day of kindergarten with their little backpacks with the less optimal brain for learning to read. So there's no reason to wait and let them fail till like 2nd grade or 3rd grade, right? So what we need to do is to find them, to determine who is it who will struggle with learning to read, and what can we do right then. And so here you see the arc again, right? That area, the highway that connects the back of the reading network with the front. And we can, as an example, look at this. And we can look at this in pre-readers and beginning readers and fluent readers. And we can show that there are differences in the arc between kids who have a familiar risk versus not, but also between kids who subsequently become good readers compared to poor readers. So the rate of development of that arc is off, okay? We also have a baby study. And so the way we do this is we ask the parents to come to Boston Children's Hospital about an hour before their best nap time, the child's best nap time, usually the parent's best nap time too. And we say, okay, can you please put your baby to sleep right now? And then they put their baby to sleep right like this, right? Baby falls asleep. We put the baby in our MRI machine, which, by the way, is just a big magnet. It has no X-rays or any other harmful rays. And then the baby sleeps peacefully in there for 3 hours. We get all of our measurements done. We look at the arc and all other things. And then the baby wakes up rested, and they all go home. No, it's really hard. And I have a wonderful team of baby whisperers, and they have really odd times they work. So sometimes the baby's best time is the nighttime, and then they, measure the baby at 10 p.m. And sometimes the baby sleeps best at, 7 a.m. because they have been up since 4 a.m. And so we really work with the window, and we really support caregivers how to put their babies to sleep. And we have a success rate of about 75%. And you can, if it doesn't work out, you can come back. You don't have to. And so we also look at the brains of the parents. And so you can see like how we do this. So we're really good at putting other people's babies to sleep, not so much ours. And some parents even ask us, can we take the machine back home because she slept so much better in here than he ever did at home. Okay, so this is my daughter. When we started, she's now a fourth grader. So it just shows you how long we've been doing this. And what we showed is that already, if you have a familiar risk of dyslexia, the arcuate fasciculus, that arc, is atypical in babies as early as 4 to 6 months. And then we follow them, and we see them every year. And so here you see first like this arc and how, you see differences in infants, pre-readers, beginning readers, fluent readers, and how, you can almost follow the same segments here. And so if you look longitudinally, so about 45 infants now are 6 years old. So just imagine how long this research study is going on. And we still are looking for new babies. So if you have one or you're expecting one, please consider this. We'll follow your family for many years. And now we are looking at these 6-year-olds, and we ask the question, like, if you're a good reader or you're really on par with your reading development, is that does your brain in infancy look different than kids who develop dyslexia or struggles with reading? And what we could show is that arc that I was introducing you earlier in infancy is very strongly associated with phonological awareness and vocabulary knowledge at age 6. All right? What that means is not that, we don't have to do any teaching anymore because it's all determined in infancy, right? Remember back when I started to talk and I talked about nature and nurture? So it just shows that there is a nature component, but that just means we need to, put a lot more nurture in it and early on, all right? Okay, so let's also talk about the READ study. And before we go a little bit more into screening, how much time do I have? Anyone? Sorry. Another 10 minutes? Okay, right. All right, so the READ study I wanted to introduce you to is a study we did with John Gabrielli at MIT, where we basically went to school districts and we said, hello, we are Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, MIT. We would like to screen every incoming kindergartner in your school. We do this one-on-one. We provide everything. We work with your schedule. We do it in the summer before kindergarten, or 1 hour a day, or in after school on weekends, or all kids in 2 days, or whatever you prefer. And then we follow them longitudinally. And we were really naive because we started this in 2011. That was before any screening legislation, any discussion about screening. And everyone was just saying, we were very naive because we had a lot of school districts say, oh, no, we don't want you anywhere close to us. And we said, why not? And they said, because if you guys, with your credentials, come and identify children at risk in kindergarten, we need to change our system. We need to move all the support from 3rd grade to kindergarten, and we need to retrain people, and we don't even know what to do with them in kindergarten, and so on and so on. So there's one administrator I'll never forget. It's a school district that's very close to where my office is. And she said to me, Professor Gaab, I can guarantee you that these kids will still struggle in 3rd grade. We'll find them then. We'll give them exactly what they need. So that just illustrates, right? So they were just not seeing what it does to mental health what it does to their background knowledge, to their vocabulary, to how they feel about themselves learning and reading and yeah. And so, but we eventually found school districts. And what we could show is that there are 6 distinct cognitive profiles of early reading, and they are stable over time. So we could show that if you were in one of these profiles that showed that you have, low rapid onset naming or low phonological awareness and verbal short-term memory, that you stayed in this, in first grade, in second grade. It was really stable over time. It was possible to identify children early, and this is not the only study that showed this. All right, so let's look at the screening for the last couple minutes. So the idea here is to move to a comprehensive early risk screening and evidence-based response to screening within general education. All right, so the idea is not that we diagnose children at age 4. Right? I often hear like, oh, that's the lady that diagnoses kids with dyslexia at age 4. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to really determine who is at risk, right? To do that high cholesterol. If you have high cholesterol, you don't get a heart disease diagnosis. And then, do like evidence-based response to screening within general education. And yes, that requires teacher training, a lot of good teacher training, and a lot of good reading instructions to start with. That's based on the science of reading, which then leads to lower rates of dyslexia and improved reading outcome in children who eventually get a diagnosis. Okay, some of them may still get a diagnosis, but then they've already had many years of intervention, so their reading skills will be much better than if they would just start right here. So what should we screen for? And so there are some people who believe like, oh, we should just wait till first grade and then they can read, and reading is the best predictor of reading, etc. So here you see the different components of the DIBELS, which is a common test for screening. And what it shows is here's kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And if it shows, like, for instance, here is the non-word fluency, that we have floor effects all the way till like the end of first, beginning of third grade for most of these measures. All right, what that means is kids simply can't do this. And so it's not a good predictor if you can't do it because you have a floor effect. Right? If you think about the development of reading and how language precedes the development of reading, we need to more think about, early markers that are not, the single word reading or non-word reading. They become predictive later on, but, we can't really use them in kindergarten or first grade. All right, so we talked about these predictors. So these are highly recommended. What we should keep in mind is that phonological deficits have been linked to subsequent word reading outcome. However, not all children who have a phonological deficit develop problems with word reading. And not all children with word reading show deficits, word reading deficits, show deficits with phonological processing memory. So we need to go back to this and really look at these different factors. And that's why you need to screen not just for phonological awareness. You need to screen for like a battery so that all of these strands in the reading rope are basically covered that could potentially lead to problems with reading. All right, so these are my sons. They always get mad if I just show the older sister. So that's why I put them here. And so here, what we say is screening, and this is something I wrote for the International Dyslexia Association, screening should be short, right? We are not doing diagnostics here. We're doing screening. So 15, 20 minutes max. It needs to be comprehensive. I hope I convinced you. If you just screen for phonological awareness or just screen for rapid onset naming, you will have a lot of false alarms and misses. It can be resourceful. So often school districts come to me and say, it's an unfunded mandate. What am I going to do? I have no money for buying new screening instruments. Then I say, show me what you use to identify children in third grades. And some of these things some of these assessments are normed for 5-year-olds. And so you can develop a screening plan that way. It has to be early. I haven't talked a lot about ESL. That would be a whole different hour. But it's important that you include kids because they are often identified way too late because we always hear the, oh, let them learn English first and then their reading will catch up kind of. But the prevalence is the same, right? The prevalence of dyslexia, which is around 10 to 12%, is the same if you're growing up in a Spanish-speaking country or here. Dialect inclusion, very important. So there's been wonderful work by Nicole Patentary and Julie Washington showing that African American children are at higher risk for developing problems with reading because of African American dialect, which often has a different phonological structure of the mainstream English language. And it should almost be like treated as like a second language. And you need to make an effort to teach children what school language and what home language, as you would do with another ESL child. So there's been a lot of movement and a lot of development of screeners for kids who are African American dialect speakers. And it's really important that we do evidence-based response to screening. All right, so we can screen the whole world. It doesn't change anything if we don't do anything. If we don't do anything in response to it. All right, so. And that happens right now, and it happens in Massachusetts, right? I get a call, and they say, well, Dr. Gaab, can you help us with developing a screening protocol for our district? And I said, sure. And I said, so what is your plan for responding to the screening results? And they said, no. The legislation just says we need to screen. There's nothing we need to do in response to it. And I'm like, no, you don't understand, right? We can screen the whole, we could screen the whole world for high cholesterol. If we don't do anything, it's completely useless. And so that's important that a screening protocol has both components. So if you want to know more about how to screen, we wrote this 80-page Screening for Dyslexia white paper that you can find on the National Center for Improving Literacy. There is all these factors to consider for selecting the right screener. Like you want to make sure that the student population is right. So if the screener is normed in the middle of UK on 300 pre-K children, middle class, it may not be a right screener for your inner city school. You want to look at the resources in the school district. Some screeners require a lot of personnel, a lot of training for administering and interpretation. So you want to make sure you have a screener maybe that's a little bit less resource intensive. If you want to know where are the good screeners, go to this website. The National Center on Intensive Intervention has this wonderful, wonderful resource where they have all the screeners, and I just picked randomly a screenshot. You can filter for reading and math, and it tells you exactly the evidence behind each screener. Yeah. All right. Okay, people want to take a picture. Yeah. Okay. Also on the National Center for Improving Literacy, you find all these wonderful material to communicate with your educators, other stakeholders in the district, parents, what screening means. What is screening? How is it different from diagnostics? What does it mean the screener has to be reliable and has to show high validity? What does it mean that it has to have high classification accuracy, et cetera, et cetera? We also developed this list here, it's back online, that has all screeners we could possibly think of out there, hundreds, and compares them with each other. So this one does not tell you like which one to use, which one not. It simply gives you all screeners out there, and you can nicely compare them. Which ones have evidence, which ones don't, what kind of evidence, how expensive are they administered on a tablet or in paper pencil, how do I score it, how many personnel do I need, what kind of components do they screen for, et cetera, et cetera. So you can find that resource on our website. We also developed a screener I want to mention. So this is now a company, so there is a conflict of interest, that's why I'm mentioning it. So this is one that will come out this fall. It is a tablet-based it's self-assessment. So you basically hand it to the child, and the child plays the game on the iPad. It screens for all these components I introduced earlier in 15 to 20 minutes. You can do it in one sitting or just 2 or 3 minutes a day. It gives you an action plan, tells you exactly which kid is at risk for what, as well as a combined risk index where we take the whole profile into account, and helps you with tools of what's next. So it gives you videos that tells you how can you address this in the classroom. So it really gives you the evidence-based response to screening. It gives you professional development links, free resources, et cetera, et cetera. And there's just some screenshots. Okay, so it works, right? So there's people like Hugh Katz who has shown that using the Dibbles and some other screeners, if you screen kids and you give them intervention in kindergarten, they have much better outcomes. Okay, so and I'm happy to share some of these resources slides with you. But where should we screen? We are now doing a big push to screen in pediatricians' offices, to screen at the 4- and 5-year well visits. So we wrote this paper that outlines exactly how this could be done. So if the pediatrician says, no, we don't get reimbursed, we only screen for ADHD and autism, they don't like me at all right now, but then you can have a paper. All right, and there's other great resources showing, let's here again, improving, National Center for Improving Literacy, showing you exactly which states have which kind of legislation. All right, so what are the challenges? I think it's what are we actually screening for? A lot of school districts are picking tools that are not screening for word reading. They're screening for reading comprehension. That's not a dyslexia screener. Some other perception that this will lead to overcrowded special education. No, it's the opposite. If we identify children at risk early and we address it in general education, when brain plasticity is much higher, so we know that the brain is a lot more plastic the younger someone is. So we know this, it's much easier to learn a foreign language the younger you are. So if you address this early, you need to invest a lot less than if you wait till 3rd or 4th grade. Some other challenges are, data literacy in schools, how to interpret the data, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm going to finish here because I think I'm running out of time. Here is some myth about dyslexia screening, and I'm happy to provide you with some of the slides. But I think we went through all of them, basically saying that no, we are not overcrowding SPED. No, we're not diagnosing at age 4. Yes, we can identify children reliably. Yes, we know what to do with them. And they will not catch up and grow out of it if you just wait. Okay. All right. So thank you. And I want to just conclude with saying every child has the right to learn to read. And so we have to make sure that we help them and to maximize the joy of learning to read. Thank you to all the families participating.
Thank you, Dr. Gaab, very much for being here. If anyone is here on campus and needs to get to class, that's fine. We're a little over time, but I know my students are sticking around. Everyone's welcome to stick around for a little bit of Q&A time. So we do need to ask you to ask any questions into the microphone so that the webinar participants online can hear. So anyone like to ask a question? Okay.
Hi, thanks for the great lecture. I just wonder for an adult that has reading comprehension issues that go back to childhood, there's like looking at words versus actually like looking and kind of understanding them. And at my age, I was just wondering what some non-toxic options might be for, getting a little bit better. Because I think from a neuroquant brain MRI, I have like a low amount of gray and white matter, and the prefrontal cortex is like only 3 cycles a second. Just wonder if that's something that can improve through things like, hyperbaric oxygen chamber, EUI, infrared red light therapy helmet, neurofeedback, or maybe also seeing like a environmental illness doctor. Just curious what you thought.
Yeah, no, the things you mentioned have not been supported by research. What really helps is, I've seen in adults, is really go back and try to remediate some of these early stages of reading that were maybe not taught properly or are still a struggle. So really going back and doing like proper one-on-one tutoring with someone who is really experienced with tutoring adults is a really great option. There's great assistive technology. There's, I think the Massachusetts branch of the International Dyslexia Association has an adult dyslexia group where they meet and they talk about some of these approaches, some of individuals that do tutoring for struggling readers in adulthood, as well as assistive technology that is helpful on a daily basis and how to best use it. So I think it's a combination of the two. But anything like glasses or vitamins or any other thing has not been proven. No. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being here today. You had mentioned professional development for teachers, particularly in the early grades, so that children with who are identified early in the screening, that they can hopefully stay on track with their typical developing peers. What specific professional development would you recommend for school districts and for schools to get their teachers to where they need to be to make that happen?
Yeah. There's great ones out there. I don't want to, mention specific ones on this webinar, but I'm happy to give you some afterwards. So there are great ones that have been shown to be really successful. And there's also a really big push for higher education to make sure that, incoming and new teachers are trained correctly and have some of this knowledge already. And so I think that there is good options out there, and I'm happy to discuss that with you afterwards. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I was wondering about your screener. I know you said it was conflict of interest, but I did have a question.
Yeah, sure.
And what age could that be given to incoming kindergarteners?
Yeah, so the screener is for 4 to 6 year olds. And currently we are finishing up the validation study. So we are in 9 states. We tested 500 kindergarteners in the fall, and now we do them in the spring to make sure that we have predictive validity. But that's the last piece we need. We also do a lot of pilot schools right now, especially in the area. So if you know a school district or a single school or a one classroom that wants to be part of this, please let me know, and I'm happy.
Okay.
There should be, oops. Yeah, the info should be
email.
here. Yeah, so
Okay.
so there's either option that you're part of these studies, or what we do is we provide you with the equipment and let you try it out,
Okay.
and then you give us feedback, and so we learn and make it better, etc.
And you said it's going to be ready this fall, or?
Yes, so
Okay.
we are already signing up school districts for this fall. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go back to the webinar table. We promised
Yep.
the people online we'd ask at least one or two of their questions.
Sure.
Okay, so this is from some of the people who are online watching the webinar. So Laura Williams asked, what do you think would help people change their mind? So she asked the question that in her school they have a new screening law that requires all public schools to screen students in K through 2 for dyslexia risk. The problem is that teachers, administrators, and even teacher training programs don't seem to understand the science of reading. What do you think would help change their minds? And how can we get them to see that there is a problem?
Yeah, that's a. I wish I had the answer to that question. So I think that there are some promising things happening. So there are some states now that are trying to mandate the science of reading on the state level. There are some pushes for higher education to change the teacher training, to make sure that the science of reading is included. There are some pushes, I know even in Massachusetts, to eliminate reading curriculum that are not evidence-based. I think that will hopefully happen in the next couple of years. Also, a lot of awareness, a lot of science literate administrator who can convey what is actually the science showing and what are the results. So I think it's still the $1 million question, but I think there is a lot more progress than there was 5 years ago.
We have time for maybe one more.
Hello, and I'd like to thank you for coming here. As someone who has quite a bit of learning disabilities, I both have dyslexia and ADHD. It really wasn't helped back when I was in my younger years until I would say middle school, where I did have some actual good teachers who understood that, helped me really learn how to read and really love reading and understanding language. And I don't really see much people even talk about dyslexia. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for coming, and congratulations on being here and every successful step. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got one more. We can't say no to Nancy, who made a lot of this possible. So thank you.
I'd just ask you to end, Dr. Gaab, with some comments about when you are working with families, either in the lab or through your work, or as you're giving these talks, because I know you've done them in many communities. Can you just comment about the reception of parents and what their role, just in the information of some of this information, if you find that how it's well received, or what happens?
Yeah, no, I think it's usually well received, and I feel like there's lots of great organizations that help, like Decoding Dyslexia or the International Dyslexia Association. I think for parents, advocacy is huge, and it has shown in the example of Decoding Dyslexia that it can lead to legislation. Also to really go to your school district and say what kind of screening do we do, and how often do we do it, and what kind of screening instruments are you using, and are you teaching the science of reading, and how can you tell me what reading curriculum you use, and where's the evidence? Really demanding this, and there's great work by journalist Emily Hanford. So if you don't know her podcasts, Hard Words, it's a whole series, so that's also really great start to start a conversation. But usually parents are really relieved and say oh wow, I'm glad I know earlier with my youngest, or I can really take this preventive approach and not just have this oh wait, they will catch up kind of attitude. I think if we all work together, it will make a big difference.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Gaab. And thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you to Nancy Duggan and Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts for helping to make this connection. And we have a survey about our lectures and webinars that we'll send out. My students can paste it into the online chat right now, and for those of you in person, we'll email it to you if you don't mind giving us some feedback about this event and sharing your ideas for future events that the Chris Walsh Center may hold. Thanks again, everyone.